Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel. So for today's video, I'm going to be doing a kind of follow-up to a video I made a few weeks ago about the video game The Last of Us Part 2, and specifically a bunch of transphobia that was coming out in the Last of Us community after the release of some spoilers that were basically stolen from the developer of The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog, and was released online, basically spoiling the entirety of the game for a lot of people. Now, a lot of people in the community saw these spoilers and were very upset at some of the story developments within the game, specifically, and I'm not going to say any spoilers in this video, I'm just going to kind of talk in mostly abstracts, but specifically they were upset about a certain character, I believe named Abby, who does something very controversial within the game's story. Now, this character was a female presenting person who had really big muscles and smaller breasts, and many in the community took that character to be trans. Now, this was not confirmed within the actual spoilers that were released if this character is trans or not. She may be, she may not be, we don't know. But a lot of people interpreted her to be trans, and because of this controversial event that this character does in the game, a lot of people took to Reddit to basically express their anger and frustration with this story development in the form of transphobic memes and jokes basically targeted at this character and targeting that this character may or may not be trans. I showed a bunch of memes in the last video to say what I'm talking about. I'm not going to show them again here just because I don't really want to show really transphobic stuff in my videos. And the reason that I want to do this specific video following up on it is because I saw a lot of people in the comments reacting against my video and had a couple of the same arguments crop up saying why they thought that this wasn't a problem or that it was okay or that we shouldn't really, or I shouldn't have been talking about this issue in the first place, and for them it's just microscopic problem. And I really kind of took issue with a lot of the things that were said in those comments. Not that you can't critique me or take issue with the things that I say in my videos. I love hearing people's comments. But the things that people were criticizing me for or commenting are honestly the same type of comments that I see crop up not just in The Last of Us or video games, but really whenever I talk about any form of transphobia in any type of medium, be it film, be it movies, be it video games, be it books. And so I felt like this was a good case study to kind of specifically look at a couple of these comments and directly address them and why I think that I don't give them much water and why I don't really hold much weight in these types of reactions against when people talk about transphobia in a community or in a work of fiction. So I kind of want to just bring them up and talk about them here really briefly. So the first one, and kind of the easiest to debunk right here, is the comment that people were saying is like, well, people weren't really upset about her being trans, they were upset about the thing that this character does in the story, and they're just expressing their anger. So that's really what it's about, so you don't really need to talk about the transphobia. So here's the thing. It is 100% okay to be upset at a story development in a game. If something happens in a game that you think doesn't fit the work, doesn't make sense, isn't true to the spirit of the game or the story in your mind, that is 100% valid. That is an A-okay critique. There's nothing wrong with you having a problem with something that happens in the narrative of a work that you enjoy. That's what I do on this channel all the time. I talk about things that I have problems with in things that I love. So that's fine. The problem becomes when you express that anger and that resentment at that story development in a way that is harmful to a specific group of people. And even more so when that specific group of people have nothing to do with the story. Now, let's even take that this character in The Last of Us Part 2 is trans. And you still had an issue with what this character does in the story. Even if she is trans, it does not mean it is okay to go online and start spouting transphobia against trans people. Like, for example, what if, let's just say it was a person of color, and a person of color did really terrible things in a story, and I've had a problem with the things that this character does in a story that I really love. If I went online and started ranting about people of color and making jokes at people of color's expense, because this character just happened to be a person of color who did this thing in the story, that would be racist. That would be a racist thing for me to do. The same occurs here in the sense of transphobia. You can complain about a story development. You can complain about a thing that a trans character does. I'm not saying that if a trans character does something you don't like and you criticize a trans character, it's instantly transphobia. It's okay to criticize trans characters doing things in stories. That's just how criticism works. What it does not allow you to do is to just blanket make fun of transgender identity in and of itself. You can't just say trans people are dumb and that's your like criticism of the story. It has nothing to do with the story beat that you're talking about. You could talk about like, I take this issue with the story, this issue with this story, this issue with the story, and the character happens to be trans. Or maybe even take issue with how a trans person was represented in that moment, but it does not mean you get to insult trans people as a group. So that was the first comment that I saw popping up a bunch, and yeah, it was the one that annoyed me most directly. Now, the second type of comment that I saw coming up is one that I honestly see a bunch, not just in video games, but a lot of the time when I talk about things like Star Trek Discovery or Star Trek Picard or science fiction shows that have gotten caught up in this sort of SJW culture wars. Like, SJWs are ruining my favorite TV show with their forced diversity and things like that. And so whenever that type of conversation starts surrounding of work, one of the type of comments that I see come up is like, well, I don't hate forced diversity. I don't hate diversity. I don't hate people of color or trans people or LGBTQ people being in things that I love. I mean, I like The Expanse. And The Expanse is incredibly diverse as a show. So I really don't hate those people. I just hate how this show does it. And this is coming up in The Last of Us Part 2. They're like, well, I'm not really transphobic. I liked trans characters and women character when they appeared in other works of fiction. Like, I saw someone going around like saying that it was okay when their women were beefy and strong in Star Wars The Mandalorian. There was a character in that who was sort of like the big, like, strong bounty hunter type woman in Star Wars The Mandalorian, but I don't like it in The Last of Us Part 2, and that excuses my transphobia. Which is many levels of things going on there, but like I said before, I see this in the Star Trek community a lot. It's like, well, I don't like Star Trek Discovery because of their forced diversity and ramming their politics down my throat. I like something like The Expanse, which is a diverse show. Now, this gets a little bit grayer and less clear-cut because there is an element that this criticism does kind of make sense. You can hate how certain story beats are implemented or how certain things are talked about and how certain ideas are talked about within different shows. And that's perfectly okay. To say that The Expanse does something better than Discovery is a perfectly legitimate criticism. And if you think how diversity is handled on The Expanse is better than how diversity is handled on Discovery, for example, that's a fair argument to make. I would say that I think, for me personally, just to get off on this side tangent, just really briefly, I think Discovery does it better because I think they like have more people of color and LGBTQ people being main characters taking active participation in the plot. But that's just me. Expanse definitely does have a bunch of diversity. And I certainly think The Expanse, honestly, I think The Expanse is a better show. Sorry, I'm getting way off topic of The Last of Us, but I think it's kind of wanting to show that this criticism does have some levels of merit. The problem with it becomes basically this idea of you're kind of saying my black friend excuses me being racist right now, but with a TV show. We all kind of know how that idea works when you're basically saying it's like, well, you know, I can say this thing because I have a gay friend or I have a black friend. So me saying this kind of really problematic thing is totally fine. And you're doing that with a show. So you're saying in The Last of Us, like, well, I'm just doing this transphobic thing or saying this thing or being critical of trans people in this work because, you know, I like trans people and some other things, so it excuses me being transphobic right now. Just because you may like trans people in one thing or people of color in one thing or diversity in one thing does not excuse you from being, you know, harmful or insulting to that group of people elsewhere. You don't get to just say, like, I liked it here and it excuses my racism, sexism, transphobia elsewhere. That's not how that works. You know, just because you're not racist in one situation doesn't mean you can't be racist anywhere else. Just because you're not transphobic in one situation does not mean that you can't be transphobic anywhere else. I've done this and experienced this myself. I have, you know, I try to think that I am a good ally to people of color. That's not for me necessarily to say, but I try to be, and I try to talk about those issues that community faces as often as I can when it comes up naturally, and my platform, you know, has a place to say something like that. But there are other times where I screw up. I mess up when I talk about the people of color community in many different areas, sometimes in the videos that I make here. Me having done a good job in one video talking about that community does not excuse me when I make a mistake elsewhere. So while that comment does hold some water in the sense that yes, you can like how one show does something over another show, it does not mean that when you are transphobic, sexist, racist, anything like that in another area, just because you aren't somewhere else, doesn't mean that it's not still sexist, racist, or transphobic here. So yeah, that's just one I see crop up quite a bit. And then the final one that I really want to talk about here is a weird one that is kind of specific to The Last of Us, but I see crop up in slightly different ways in other discussions elsewhere. But to talk about The Last of Us specifically, one of the comments that I see coming up strangely is that this transgender person, if she's trans, couldn't be in the apocalypse because The Last of Us Part 2 is a post-apocalyptic story because it just wouldn't make sense for a trans person to exist or for her to have that body type in The Last of Us Part 2. Which I see that argument so often in the comments is like, yeah, well, it just makes no sense that she would be a beefy, like, huskier woman in the apocalypse, regardless of if she's trans or not. Which to me is like, what? What are you talking about? Number one, if you want to talk about the logistics of The Last of Us Part 2 specifically, this is an apocalypse that's going on for decades at this point, or several years. So you're telling me no one ever works out in the apocalypse? You know, they clearly survive and have built communities. I'm sure they have some form of a gym. Also, people are running around from literal zombie stuff. I'm sure that they're, you know, taking care of themselves physically. And again, also, many different body types exist in the world just naturally. Some people are going to naturally be huskier, bigger people, transgender or not transgender. So to, like, argue this weird thing of like, well, her body type wouldn't exist, it makes no sense in the apocalypse, is just weird. It's just a weird kind of comment to make. Because, like, people are diverse in their bodies. Again, even removing transgender from it, like, who are you to say that someone's not gonna look like that in the apocalypse? Because people look like that anytime in history. Those types of people always existed. It's this weird, like, erasure of the community, and like this idea is like, well, women tend to look like this, and we only have recently allowed women to have a huskier appearance because we are so much more evolved. But in the apocalypse, those types of people would go away and it'd be much more feminine women and much more manly men. Like, no. Many different diverse types of people and bodies have always existed. It's just we have more ability for those types of people to have representation because of things like YouTube or much more diverse content available to us. So we see these people more, but they've always existed. So this weird idea that they wouldn't exist in the apocalypse makes no sense. And like I said, physically that makes sense too. And it's also like, if I talk about it within a trans context, because some people will say like trans people wouldn't exist in the apocalypse, like yes, trans people would exist in the apocalypse. Also, they were talking about like she wouldn't have access to hormones, she wouldn't be able to transition and everything. It's like, well, trans people would be able to exist even without transitioning. Also, again, how would you know they wouldn't have access to hormones? Have you not seen any apocalypse movie ever where they go and raid pharmacy companies and like grab pharmaceuticals? Also, we saw earlier in The Last of Us, there are doctors that exist in this universe. Like we saw it, spoilers for the first Last of Us game. There's like a whole hospital you raid at the end of that game and there are doctors there. So, and they perform surgery and have technology. So there's nothing to say that someone couldn't get access to surgery and things like that. It probably wouldn't be a priority in that time, but it's certainly technically possible. So it's just a weird comment, and I see that, you know, that specific one is kind of specific to The Last of Us, but you see it in a lot of like different types of things. Like there weren't lesbians in the Renaissance period, which is a weird one, but like there weren't lesbians in, you know, pick your historical context. There weren't gay people during this time. There weren't trans people during, you know, the Renaissance. It's like, yes, there were. We just didn't necessarily talk about them as much in popular culture until very recently. But if you look in any historical document, those people existed. They have always existed. They may not have been called the same thing. They may not have identified exactly the same way as we talk about things now, just because understandings of identities have changed over time. But trans people, as we kind of think of them now, have always existed, maybe just under a different moniker or just not talked about because, society sucks for trans people many times. So yeah, I think that I kind of made my point on that. So yeah, those are sort of the three major things that I kept see cropping up in this discussion over and over and over again. I just really wanted to address them within the context of The Last of Us because it was just the most recent version of this that I had seen. But I'd like to hear what all of you think. Do you agree with me? Do you think these comments are silly or offensive in many ways like I've pointed out? Or do you find more of these types of comments? And what do you see? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to give this channel a subscribe if you want more discussions about LGBTQ issues within the geek world, or if you want to talk about Star Trek or geek topics. I don't always talk about LGBTQ issues just exclusively, but I do a lot. So if you want any of that, just hit the subscribe button and the bell as well so you don't miss anything. And if you want to help make this channel even better, especially right now where I don't have a full-time job anymore, you can help me out over on Patreon. But regardless of if you subscribe, comment, or help out on my Patreon, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you all of you for watching, and a special thank you to my patrons, including my amazing commander level and above patrons, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen, Eli Berg-Moss, Sela Roman, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Stefan Schuhart, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Ish the Mad, Randy Thompson, Mouse Pounder, Wellington Marcus, Lorena Mesa, Alexander Miller, Mari Neckar, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, Aaron Brown, Munir Amlani, Maggie Evans, Maeve, Wendizzle Bizzle, Dante St. James, Wayne Twitchell, Patrick Shannon, Din Hagney, Mystic the Monarchete, Bree Beecher, and Polly Mina. All of your support means so much to me right now, so thank you to all of you. Live long and prosper.